Leaders from the 5 Brics nations take their places in Brasilia on the final day of their annual meeting. Hello, I'm Mike Walter, and this is The Heat. The leaders of China, Russia, India, Brazil, and South Africa ended their annual meeting with a warning about trade tensions. The group expressed concerns that policy uncertainty is undermining confidence in international commerce, investment, and economic growth. The Heat's Anand Naidoo has been covering the summit and joins us from Brasilia. With us as well as Creomar de Souza. He's a political risk consultant and the founder of Dharma Political Risk Strategy. Joining us from Beijing is Jiang Shixue. He's the director of Shanghai University Center for Latin American Studies, and Anton, Fedyashin, focusing on Russian and European history as a professor at American University, is right here in Washington, D.C., and on our set with us today. Anand, let's start with you. You've been there for a few days now. We all know that it's much more than just this presidential summit. There's a lot of meetings that go up before this with foreign ministers, other top-level officials trying to iron out things so that they can come out with this communique, this statement at the end of the day. So give us a sense of what we learned today.
Hi, Mike. Great to talk with you again. That's right. The BRICS Summit has ended here in Brasilia. In fact, 4 of the 5 leaders who were here are now on their way home. That statement that you talked about, the declaration, as you pointed out in your introduction, the main thrust of that was about the world economy, and there is deep concern about the downturn in the world economy. These leaders expressed that, and they placed the blame on unilateralism, on protectionism. Clearly, this was a reference to the United States, although they did not mention the United States by name, nor did they mention President Trump. But they are concerned that this international trade tensions is undermining investments, undermining commerce, undermining international trade. In many respects, it echoed the words of President Xi Jinping yesterday, on Wednesday, here at the summit, in which he talked about protectionism, unilateralism, and bullying, saying that all of this is threatening global growth right now. But the declaration also addressed some other hot-button issues around the world. They focused on the Middle East. They talked about Syria. They said they committed to the territorial integrity of Syria and that they would like to see a negotiator or a non-military solution to the conflict there. They talked about the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and again reiterated their commitment to a 2-state solution as the way out of that crisis. They also talked about other things, about the Paris Climate Accord. Again, a veiled reference to the United States. They reaffirmed their commitment to this climate accord. They talked about the primacy of the United Nations as the world body that is best equipped to deal with international issues. There was some concern expressed about the arms race in space. In fact, the leaders called for some kind of binding multilateral commitment to regulate this so that it doesn't get out of control. And there was some talk about reform of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. As you're fully aware, Mike, the WTO, in some respects, has been at the center of the dispute, the trade dispute between the United States and China.
Yeah, it was a really thick communique. It covered a lot of ground, but of course, this is always about trade, banking, money, all of that. Where did that come down?
Yeah, a big focus. You mentioned banking, a big focus on the BRICS Development Bank. This is the finance arm, also known as the New Development Bank, the finance arm of BRICS. You know, these are developing countries. They're looking for finance to build their economies, to build infrastructure and things like this. Now, the bank has been coming under some criticism. It's been criticized for being too slow, for not making loans fast enough. It's also been criticized on transparency issues. And one other criticism is that it issues loans in the US dollar denomination, which leaves countries, developing countries, open to currency risk. But the president of the bank, KV Kamath, he was here and he tried to reassure people that you know, the bank was getting on the right track right now. In fact, he talked about opening the bank's membership to other countries. He said, look, all United Nations countries should be eligible for membership in this BRICS bank. You know, that is something which, of course, the leaders will be considering. They want to increase the loan book, or the capital that the bank has right now. Well, I have with me Creomar de Souza. Creomar, great to have you with me. Let's talk about the BRICS summit from the point of view of Brazil. And in many respects, it marked I would say, the end of tensions really between China and Brazil. Relations have been fraught for some time. President Jair Bolsonaro has made efforts for the last 11 months since he came to office to try and repair that. Did he succeed?
Yeah, I believe, first of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure being here representing my firm and also talking with you and the audience about these such important subjects for Brazilian people. I believe first of all, President Bolsonaro made a campaign in giving a lot of really aggressive narrative against China. But after the election and when he became the president, he perceived the reality. This reality for Brazil, it's really clear. Brazil needs China for achieve development. Brazil needs China, the Chinese market, the Chinese money, the Chinese opportunities. So the last 11 months, President Bolsonaro spent a lot of energy to deconstruct all the negative impressions that he made about himself over China. And it's important in this subject to highlight the role that Vice President Hamilton Mourão developed in the way to advocate in favor of China inside the Brazilian government. And now I believe the Brazilian government succeed to establish a much more mature and a much more proactive relationship between Brazil and China.
It's very positive, isn't it? Because we saw those agreements being signed yesterday between the two leaders. Also, China is now committed to make a $1 billion investment in the port of São Luís. That augurs well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's good. It's important. Brazil is trying now this new government is trying to put Brazil on the road of the open and free economy. In this way, President Bolsonaro and Minister of Economy Paulo Guedes are trying to achieve good partnerships for development. This kind of sign-out made by China, investing in a Brazilian port, with the fact that Brazilian government is trying to open new opportunities of business in Brazil, it's a really good sign off for Chinese investments here. I believe if I was a Chinese investor here today, I will feel much more comfortable about any kind of variable in terms of political risks to invest in Brazil.
President Bolsonaro has been talking today. In fact, he said, that's on Thursday, he said that confidence in Brazil is growing, but he's aware that reforms need to be made. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
Brazil still has a way to go. New reforms are coming for us so that we can be sure that the business environment in Brazil is becoming more attractive.
So, in terms of reforms, what does the president have to do?
I believe first of all, President must to establish a good relationship with the Congress. The last 11 months was characterized by the fact that the executive branch in Brazil has a not common or a not normal relationship with the Congress. The approval of the pensions reform was much more based on the fact that the President of the House and the President of Brazilian Senate are engaged in this agenda. But when we are talking about the other necessary reforms for Brazil, taxes reforms, administrative reform, and also a repactuation of the Federation Pact here, it's urgent for the for the executive branch that they must assume a new kind of relationship with the Brazilian legislative. The key point in this subject is the fact that President Bolsonaro was elected, promised by his electors that he will never talk with the Congress in the old terms. And when you are talking about democracy, the old terms are just negotiation.
Right.
And now he's in the middle of a crossroad. He must talk with the Congress, but he's putting on the corner by his own electors.
Looking at the Brics summit over these last 2 days, what were your main takeaways from it?
I believe in terms of Brazilian point of view, the most important issue that we achieved here is the fact that we have a normalization with in the relationship between Brazil and China. China is the most important economic partner of Brazil, and China is a key piece in the Brazilian strategy of of economic growth for the next years. So the normalization between Brazil and China, and probably this new approach for the BRICS Development Bank are the main achievements in the point of view of Brazilian government.
You know, one of the things that BRICS has, a mechanism, if you like, is that it sets up goals, but then it monitors those goals to look at members' compliance with it. And if you look at this summit over the past 2 days, they talked about a whole range of issues, technology issues, green technology issues. In fact, the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, he also said that he was concerned about the fact that, you know, our system right now, our computer infrastructure system around the world is so vulnerable to viruses and things like that, so that needs to be beefed up. We heard the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi talk about efforts to counter terrorism. So these will be checked in the months ahead. That is a system that really works for BRICS, doesn't it?
Yeah, I believe it works, and it's important in terms of Brazil that Brazil it's a middle country. And we need this kind of multilateral forum to advance in a lot of important agendas. And specifically, we have a huge challenge ahead, is the fact that Brazil must to integrate itself in the new technologies, specifically 5G. And when we are talking about 5G, we have a geopolitical threats in terms of terrorism, viruses, and other issues that can compromise Brazilian infrastructure, Brazilian investments, and Brazilian economic environment. So the opportunity to talk with such important partners as Russia, India, South Africa, and China mainly, give to Brazil the opportunity to establish new kinds of bonds and partnerships to achieve this kind of new level in terms of infrastructure, who is a huge, huge challenge for Brazilian government in this moment.
Okay, Creomar, thanks for your thoughts and views on that. Let's send it back to Mike in Washington right now. Mike.
All right, Anand, thanks so much. We'll be checking back with both of you in a little bit later, but let's turn our attention to Anton. You know, it's interesting, you know, you talk to analysts and they point to Bretton Woods. It ushered in the stability, a new international monetary arrangement. And you know, the U.S. was seen as this poster child of this, but now you see this chaos and in these speeches talking about protectionism, bullying. They're not naming names, but it's apparent who they're talking about. And in some cases, it looks like BRICS is the model of stability. Let's listen to Vladimir Putin, what he had to say.
A consequence of this global recession is that we have witnessed the extensive use of unfair competition, unilateral sanctions, and protectionism is thriving. In such conditions, the BRICS countries have to undertake very serious efforts in order to ensure the development of our economies.
Anton, as you're well aware, a lot of people made fun of BRICS initially. You know, what do these people have in common? And yet, right now, they seem like the voice of reason. What do you make of that?
Well, BRICS is a representation of a successful cooperation and between countries that had felt like they were outsiders to the Western world and the Bretton Woods system. In 2005, when the term was first coined, I don't think anyone would have expected us to be living through the 11th summit. So we just actually went through a summit that sort of summarized the past 10 years of cooperation. And these outsiders are really showing the whole world what a cooperative, mutually respectful relationship can yield. And it's not just about the bilateral agreements, but it's the new development bank, which is a real bank and is setting itself up as an alternative to the World Bank and other IMF specifically, other institutions. So you know, the up-and-coming nations are now beginning to determine the laws by which they are playing the geo-economic game. And so far, they seem to present a much more viable alternative that is inclusive and ready to accept new members in the future, compared to a lot of the protectionist measures that we see coming out of the United States.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Jiang Shixue, I'm sure you remember President Xi at Davos. It was back in 2017, a full-throated endorsement of supporting globalization. At the time, he said at the World Economic Forum, the global economy is the big ocean you cannot escape from, and China has learned how to swim. He was basically echoing those comments again. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The current circumstances make highly relevant for us to hold this BRICS business forum and have in-depth discussions on such topics as trade and investment, innovation, and infrastructure development. When businesses have confidence, the market will enjoy vitality. I hope you will seize the opportunity, rise to the challenges, mobilize more resources from the business community, and actively invest and do more business in BRICS countries.
So how likely is that? Are we going to see this engagement get even deeper?
Well, I would like to point out that China is a very strong support for globalization because China is the second biggest economy in the world. And China is a very responsible nation, which is called so-called a country with Chinese characteristics. So China hopes that BRICS cooperation can continue to play an important role in pushing forward the global governance, respecting the UN Charter, fighting against unilateralism, and also in other fields such as cybersecurity, all kinds of things, and even global trade governance. As I said just now, that China is a believer that win-win cooperation is good for everybody. So I believe that China wants to see that BRICS cooperation can play a very important role in the future.
And Anton, one of the other things that came out of this summit, which I thought was really interesting, is Putin floating this idea that BRICS' new development bank could extend more loans in rubles. And of course, we've seen the yuan out there on the global marketplace, and a lot of strategists and analysts saying that it's going to continue to rise. Mm-hmm. What does that mean for the U.S. dollar? I mean, if we start to see loans in rubles, we start to see the yuan, what's that do with the U.S.?
Well, look, this is the de-dollarization of the global economy that is slowly creeping in. It's the inevitable consequence of the United States using economic and financial, specifically sanctions, against countries with which it disagrees. Once you start doing that and you start leveling these sanctions against many countries at the same time, it's inevitable that they will start looking for alternatives. So the dollar is still, without doubt, is the dominant currency, but we're seeing the very beginning of a major change, which will be on a par with the tectonic geopolitical shift that we're living through in the world, with new nations staking a claim to, formulating the rules of the global game. And in the financial world, we've got the same thing going on. And I don't think this is a trend that will really be reversed or stopped.
And tectonic plates move slowly. How slow do you think this is going to take?
Well, look, the new development bank was only in the stages of being sort of projected about 5 years ago. They're planning on reaching, what, $15 billion by the end of this year, according to its president that was speaking today, and they're already making investments. So 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and time, runs fairly fast when you're in geopolitics, this may be a major international corporation, or rather bank, that's working in Africa and Latin America and all over the world.
Yeah, and you can't reverse that once starts going,
of course not.
Momentum going in that direction. Anand, it seems like one of the things that you touched on is expanding membership to actually increase the pool of funds available for these needed infrastructure projects. Cyril Ramaphosa also talked about, BRICS reach going beyond the BRICS nations. Let's listen to what he had to say.
As founding members, we made a commitment that the bank should benefit not only BRICS member countries, but should also be able to extend its horizons to other emerging markets and developing countries like our own countries. South Africa is particularly impressed with the bank's efforts to ensure that it becomes a global financial institution by 2021.
Anand, it's interesting. I think you made this point that in many ways, Cyril Ramaphosa isn't just representing South Africa. He's kind of a voice for other nations as well, isn't he?
Yeah, in fact, he represents the continent of Africa when you look at it. Here we have a continent which at once is a place where there are countries with some of the fastest growing rates of growth in the world, and other times some of the most poorly performing economies, South Africa being one of them. Cyril Ramaphosa knows that he's got his work cut out. South Africa's economy is anemic right now. Its growth is around 1%, sometimes below 1%. The big challenge for him, of course, is his high unemployment rate, running at about 29%. He's been on a very concerted international drive around the world to attract investment. He's been in London attending an investment conference there. There was the very big Africa summit held in South Africa last week. And now, of course, he's at Brics. So an organization like the Brics Development Bank is very important for not just South Africa, but for the continent of Africa as well. These are countries which need investment for infrastructure, for industrial development, for the growth of these countries. The other thing that's very important for Cyril Ramaphosa is that South Africa will take over chairmanship. They assume chairmanship of the African Union next year in 2020. And Ramaphosa has talked about reforming that organization. He wants to make it more effective. He wants to streamline its operation. So, these are the messages that he's bringing to his co-leaders here in the Brics group. Another thing that Cyril Ramaphosa did talk about is the fact that he is in deep discussion with other leaders in Africa to create a continent-wide free trade zone to boost growth on the continent of Africa. And just one point, just adding to what Anton Fedyashin said a moment ago about the payment system. I mean, the current payment system is done in dollars. So if one country trades with another, it's got to be converted to dollars. The delegates here did talk about an alternative payment system that should change. In fact, one of the ideas that was proposed was that there be some kind of a system where the member states of Brics, when they trade among each other, actually pay each other in their local currencies. That way they won't be exposed to the kind of currency fluctuations which they could be if they use the dollar. There's also talk of creating some kind of cryptocurrency, although some countries have expressed concern over that because it could be open to fraud and it could be open to money laundering and things like that.
Creomar, we were just talking about South Africa and Cyril Ramaphosa. Of course, they hosted the event last year. He was on the world stage. This is sort of a coming out party for Jair Bolsonaro, and it's interesting. I want to get your take on how well he did, because this is a guy who ran against globalization as a candidate. Here he is hosting this event.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I believe the most challenge of President Bolsonaro, of the presidency of Jair Bolsonaro, is the reality. One fact is, when you are during the campaign, you can establish the most useful narrative in terms of aggregate around you some electors. But now he has some practical problems. The main problem of Brazilian economy now is growth. And it's impossible to a country like Brazil establish a huge growth in the next few years without the international cooperation, and specifically without China. And for this reason, specifically, President Jair Bolsonaro stayed at China recently, and now we are receiving here the BRICS members. And as a result, the Brazilian presidency has understood the fact that they must improve all the measurements and all the pacts that can create bounds between the BRICS to establish a safe route for economic growth. We must remember the fact that for a country like Brazil, a trade war, for example, it's a terrible news. So the president is engaged now to understand this new moment and trying to change himself and change some parts of his political narrative, besides the fact that he must to compatibilize these new cooperation actions with the fact that some of his electors here are much conservative and really and have a lot of concerns about some cooperation with countries like China and Russia.
Interesting. We've talked about Ramaphosa, we've talked about, of course, President Xi, President Putin, and of course, Bolsonaro. We have not talked about Modi and India. What's the takeaway for India after this summit?
Modi sounded very positive right before he left. For the Indians, look, this is a tough neighborhood they're in. Historically, and again, I'm an historian, I look at this in the sort of from the long perspective. India's always been challenged by Pakistan and China. During the Cold War, the Indians led the non-alignment movement and did their best to balance between the United States and Russia. So today, for the Indians, being engaged with the strongest country in Eurasia makes perfect sense. The relationship with Russia economically has been very slow to develop. I just checked the figures today. The trade turnover in 2018 was only $10 billion, which, considering the demographic size of India and the geographic size of Russia, it really is a very small figure. The Russians have gone out of their way to court the Indians in terms of energy, building nuclear power plants, and bringing liquid natural gas to India. And then there's, of course, the weapons sales, the S-400s, and the two sides are negotiating about this. For India, this makes sense in terms of security, but they're also part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Yeah.
So they are diversifying their geopolitics, which is exactly what the Russians are doing, and the Indians seem to be going at it from the economic and the geopolitical perspective, which is perhaps why Modi sounded so positive on the achievements of the summit.
Fascinating. Well, Anand, we're going to give you the last word on this. You spent the last couple of days there. What's your final takeaways from what happened in Brasilia?
You know, Mike, as we said at the outset of the show, there is deep concern here among the BRICS leaders who were here about the downturn in the world economy. In fact, President Xi Jinping of China, he said that there are challenges, not just for BRICS countries, but for other countries in the world right now. But there also are opportunities, but at the same time, unilateralism, protectionism, bullying, as he put it, is a countercurrent to this trend. I have to say, though, that they ended on an optimistic note. There was a Chinese official who said that, look, the idea is to inject some confidence into a world that's very worried right now and to uphold multilateralism, globalization, if you like, at a time when there is a great deal of uncertainty and at a time where, as we've just heard, there is rising protectionism. But, you know, there are a lot of things that happened here. There were a lot of smaller agreements that were signed. They don't make as much news as the fact that, you know, these leaders are concerned about the world economy. But, you know, they want to move ahead in things like technology and things like security and things like strategic leadership around the world. This is an organization which, as you pointed out, you know, could be a model for the rest of the world.
Well, Anand, we're going to leave it there. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure, and that is it for this edition of The Heat. For more BRICS coverage, be sure to follow CGTN America on air, online, and on social media. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for joining us.